Africa, that eventually a cure can be found, and that only certain groups, homosexuals and intravenous drug users, are at great risk of being stricken. My guest today is going to tell you to forget all that you've learned about AIDS. He says it was made in a laboratory, that it was distributed on purpose, that a cure is unlikely, and that a lot more people are going to die than many of us might believe. Joining us to talk about the alarming observations is Dr. Robert Strecker. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's begin with your qualifications, why the audience should believe you on any of this stuff.
Actually, the sole qualification that's necessary to believe me is to have the ability to read. But put that aside for a moment. I was trained at Vanderbilt Medical School. I did 6 years there. I have a PhD in pharmacology. That required extra 2 years. I did 4 years of internal medicine, then I did 2 years of gastroenterology, and after that I did 3 years of pathology. So I'm board certified in internal medicine and gastroenterology. But really, quite frankly, none of that is really relevant. What you have to do to really be able to determine for yourself whether or not AIDS came from a laboratory, which in our opinion it did, is really be able to read. And if you can read, we can show you the documents or give you the evidence that will point you in that right direction. Okay. And then you just have to make your own decision.
You're like a mainstream doctor, right? You had a practice in Southern California?
Right. I practice medicine. I think of myself as sort of a very conservative doctor. But this is sort of a diversion from mainstream medicine, but these are facts that I stumble across, and until somebody shows where I'm wrong and that they are correct, then I have to maintain what come to my own conclusion.
You stumbled across them how? How'd you get started on it?
Accidentally. I did a health plan. I was writing basically an insurance plan for a large bank in California, and in doing that I was calculating the health costs for 30,000 people over the next 10 or 15 years. In that plan, we had to determine what AIDS would cost us, and in 1983, when we began that exploration, nobody could give us the actuarial data that was necessary. So my brother and I decided we would determine for ourselves what that cost would be. That's what led us into the AIDS literature, and that's where we discovered all this that we now maintain about AIDS.
Let's have the thesis in a nutshell, and we'll
The thesis in a nutshell is that early in the 60s, 70s, that the virus AIDS was essentially requested. It was then produced in a laboratory by the mixing of two viruses known at the time, one from cattle and one from sheep. Then this virus was either intentionally or accidentally introduced into populations around the world, and that's the reason that we have the AIDS pandemic of today. We think that there will not be a vaccine produced in the near future, or the far future probably, and that the cure will lie not in the development of an allopathic or drug cure, but in the development of an actual physical technique.
Okay, we'll take these one at a time.
Right.
You said it was requested. By whom, or should I say by who?
By who, yes, and by whom. There are two things. In 1969, in testimony before the Congress of the United States, the Department of Defense requested approximately $10 million to develop new viruses and bacteria that would be refractory, or in other words, would be capable of breaking down their immune system. In 1972, in volume 47, page 257 of the Bulletin of the World Health Organization, which is the official publication of the World Health Organization, a group of scientists there said, let's make a virus that destroys the T-cell system of man selectively. Now they said, let's make this virus because we can use it to dissect out the immune system and study the immune system under different influences. In other words, if we ablate the T-cell system, we will see what happens. And one of the things that they were looking for was trying to make viruses that would cause cancer.
You said it was requested, of course, and that to prove this, all you have to do is be able to read.
Right.
What are the kinds of things that you read that indicated that it was requested and that perhaps scientists were heeding the request?
Yes, that's a very good question, because most people say, well, first off, and you can read it for yourself and determine for yourself what it says. It's in plain English, and English says basically, let's make a virus that does what AIDS does. Then people say, refuting that argument, they say would never do these kinds of experiments. But if you track forward on those references, in other words, you can cross-reference in the medical literature, you will find that they did specific experiments, in fact, producing viruses that would ablate the immune system and actually reference the original request. So like in 1976, there are papers written that show a virus that was ablating the immune system. And the paper, as one of the references, refers back to the 1972 paper, which says, let's make a virus that ablates the immune system. So there, in our mind, is no doubt that they were working specifically in attempts to produce these kinds of agents.
They? Who?
Mostly scientists.
Name some of them. Can you name some of the people that...
well, actually, I'd rather not get into naming names, but it's there for anybody who wants to look. And really, it's a group of scientists connected to cancer research and to retrovirology research. Now, the retrovirologist got interested in retroviruses, which AIDS is a member of the retrovirus group, because the retroviruses would allow you to manipulate the gene structure of different species. These viruses actually carry genetic information in and incorporate it into the genes of a species that you may want to manipulate. And that's the reason, part of the reason, that there was a great deal of interest in these species, these types of strange viruses, in the early 70s. Today, we see the fruition of those kinds of studies in the fact that retroviruses are being used for genetic manipulation of all sorts of species.
You mentioned in some of your literature the name Clemenson, with some kind of a statement made in 1975.
Right. Jay Clemenson is an internationally world-renowned epidemiologist, and he was asked to speak in Japan at an association of cancer and clinical people in 1975. And what Clemenson said was very interesting. Clemenson actually predicted the AIDS pandemic. He also predicted the present worldwide pandemics of leukemia viruses, which are presently going on and which are little talked about. Clemenson said, "Get ready, world, because scientists are creating viruses that will cause cancer but will be transferred like the flu." And he said that will occur because scientists will have adapted viruses from animals that cause cancer in animals to man. By growth of those viruses from animals, having grown them in human tissue, they will then become adapted to humans, and look out, because some of those are going to manage to run in humans. And that's exactly what's happened in our opinion. You see, there isn't just AIDS now. There's a problem of a menagerie, a group of viruses that are all suddenly appeared on the scene at the same time from about 1978 forward. All of them are related to the retrovirus group. All of them cause AIDS or leukemia or some other solid tumor. All of them are being transferred, and they're all out there now at the same time.
Let's back up for a second now. The Department of Defense is talking about it openly. Maybe we should make some of these kinds of things for use as weapons, biological weapons.
Yes.
Science starts responding. Well, yeah, we could do that.
Right.
Why would science go along with this?
Well, because there's an integral relationship between, just as there is between the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense. In this case, there's an integral relationship, particularly in the biological front, between the Department of Defense and cancer research. And so, because of genetic manipulation, there was a great deal of interest in looking at constructing new types of organisms. And that's where this sort of line blurs if you begin to look at who's doing what. One of the things that people don't realize is that the United States Biological Warfare Center, Fort Detrick, which is located in Frederick, Maryland, is an integral part of the National Cancer Institute. In other words, it's part of the big complex there, the NCI. So if you look at the biowarfare centers around the world, Porton Down in London, the English, Pasteur Institute in France, Ivanovsky Institute in Moscow, all of the giant biological warfare centers of the industrialized nations are intimately connected to cancer research.
I guess, if you're thinking about developing AIDS as a weapon, when we think of biological warfare, we're thinking of something that wipes somebody out in a matter of minutes or hours, not something that takes years.
Exactly, and of course that's not an effective weapon. And the reason is, I can tell you very easily why that does, that's not an effective weapon. It's only effective like chemical weaponry would be used, for instance, against the troops on the battlefront. The reason that it's not effective is because to stop that kind of a weapon, all that has to be done is for everybody to go inside for a few days, and a very rapidly spreading, quick-acting virus then kills everybody that's infected, and everybody not infected, after a couple of days, can go on about their business. To really wreak havoc with a country, what you want is a virus which infiltrates the population. People don't know they're infected. They then spread it among the population. It has a long delay between infection and the appearance of the disease, exactly like in the case of AIDS or its relatives.
Okay, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll talk about the green monkey theory. Stay with us. A lot of folks say green monkey somewhere in Africa. and that's how it got into humans. How do you say it got into humans?
We think that the virus was injected into humans. In other words, the true portal of entry, the mechanism that it got into human beings was by inoculation in a vaccine. We don't believe the green monkey theory for many reasons. Several, in a sense, are sort of obvious. First off, if you look at Africa, where green monkeys live, the AIDS virus doesn't grow in green monkeys.
It does not grow.
It does not grow there. Secondly, it doesn't cause disease in monkeys. Thirdly, the people most intimately associated with the green monkeys, which have been the pygmies, have been virtually AIDS-free until recently when they were infected by prostitutes from large cities. Fourthly, in Africa, if you look at the outbreak of AIDS in Africa, AIDS broke out in the industrialized city areas, not in the jungles. It's spreading from the cities to the jungles, not from the jungles to the cities. But most importantly, if you look at the genetic structure of the AIDS virus, the genes of the AIDS virus don't really exist in monkeys. So in our opinion, not only is it improbable that the virus came from there, it's virtually impossible. The genes of the AIDS virus exist in two other known animal viruses. One is named bovine leukemia virus of cattle, and the other was named Visna virus of sheep. Now, the interesting part about these two viruses are the bovine leukemia virus was a T-cell attacking virus and a B-cell attacking virus of cattle. And the Visna virus was a destroying virus. In other words, it had the capability of destroying tissue. And if we go back and we look at 1972, when they said, let's make a virus that has the capability of selectively destroying T cells, what we see is the marriage of the T-cell virus with the destroyer. And of course, that virus, we believe, was the original AIDS virus, which was named bovine Visna virus.
So there's nothing like this in monkeys, but there's definitely something like this if you combine what's in sheep and
cattle, in cows.
Okay.
And it produces disease in cattle. In other words, this virus, named bovine Visna virus, which we think is the original AIDS virus, was the virus that was producing disease in cattle, the same as bovine leukemia virus produces leukemia in cattle.
What do other doctors say, mainstream doctors, assuming that maybe you don't fit into that category, at least on this question, what do they say about the possibility of doing exactly that?
They say that we're crazy. But, of course, there has never been a doctor who actually read the references that we can refer them to who came back and said that we were wrong. The most that they've said, for people who look at this question with an open mind, and don't just close the door a priori, if you look at the question, the least that they've said after looking at several, say 50 or 100 articles, is that it's at least possible, if not obvious.
All right. Let's say we agree you can make this stuff in the lab, and that some scientists said, okay, we'll go along with it. At what point is there something in the literature that says, not only do we make it, but we tested it?
Well, no, there's nothing that says we tested it. But there is, at the same time in 1972, there is literature that says, let's not only make these kinds of agents, but let's test them. That's actually written down. And it says, basically, we will test them by putting them in our vaccines and seeing what happens during vaccination projects. Now, that was written by the same group of scientists who said, let's make these sorts of things. And again, we can refer people to where that literature actually exists. In the open medical literature, it's just sitting there for anybody to read it. It's sort of astounding.
Here's where people would have problems with it. They say, well, maybe our government would make this for use on somebody else, but would they make it and use it on us? Because it's your belief that not only that they've used it on us, but they've used a lot of other things, tested a lot of other things over the years.
Absolutely. And again, we've never really said that the AIDS virus was used by our government against us. Basically, what we maintain is the AIDS virus came from a laboratory, and then the real interesting part is who used it on whom, who put it where. That's where it gets that's the most interesting and the least scientific. But over the years, there have been over 300 open-air biological experiments conducted on United States citizens without anybody's knowledge or consent. And those are a host of experiments documented in books like A Higher Form of Killing by Paxman and Harris, Clouds of Secrecy by Leonard Cole, The Killing Winds by Gene McDermott. In other words, a lot of the people are unaware that the DoD, the Department of Defense, and the United States government conducted all kinds of experiments, not just with biological agents, but this extends into experiments. Now we're seeing, for instance, only recently have we gotten some information about how in Hanford, Washington, the Department of Energy was actually releasing all kinds of radioactivity into the air. And these sorts of experiments have been conducted over the last 30 and 40 years by the government on United States citizens without anybody's knowledge, without anybody's consent. And those experiments are clearly documented.
The places where, okay, say we don't know who is injecting it or who started the whole thing, but we do know where the outbreaks are the worst. Now, why those particular areas? Africa, for example, and Haiti.
Again, Africa, we think that it appears in Africa because we think that, again, this virus was probably tested there or inoculated there accidentally by the programs of the WHO, the World Health Organization. It's not in our mind, it's not merely a coincidence or accidental that the same people who said, let's make it, let's inject it, then the virus appears exactly, in a sense, at their test sites. So the WHO, which was doing experiments in Africa, the World Health Organization, had plenty of opportunity to test these sorts of agents there. Now, it may not have been the WHO specifically. It could have been some other biological warfare unit actually operating through the auspices of the WHO. In this kind of program, it only requires one or two people to contaminate a vaccine preparation, and you have what we call an experiment within an experiment.
You're saying it was spread when much of Africa was vaccinated for smallpox.
Yes, and we're not the only ones that have said that, of course. On the front page of the London Times, Monday, May 11th, 1987, there, the London Times, which is probably the world's leading newspaper, addressed this very question and said, is AIDS in Africa the result of smallpox eradication campaign conducted there by the WHO? And of course, they put out all kinds of data that was pointing towards that very same conclusion. We had come to the conclusion independent of them, totally based upon our findings in the literature and where we thought that this project was going. They came to the conclusion by looking at the epidemiology of AIDS in Africa and saying, wow, AIDS appears in these places, and it's the exact same places that these kinds of projects were being conducted.
It's kind of interesting that no other journalists would pick up on it, and that doctors wouldn't pick up on it. Other doctors wouldn't say anything if the literature is right there for them to read.
It is, but in some sense, this literature, a lot of it is in the veterinarian literature, and you don't find doctors, particularly MDs, reading the veterinarian literature. The interesting part about AIDS is, if you go to the library and you look up AIDS, the disease, it goes back to about 1981 or 2, and then it sort of stops, because the disease in man, in a sense, didn't really exist before then. But the problem is that you have to go back further and really look into animals and to see the kinds of experiments that were being conducted there and then that were transferred over into humans. Exactly what Clemenson was predicting or talking about in his 75 speech.
The choice of Africans, if in fact it was a choice, you're saying they were targeted perhaps because who would care?
Yes.
Something like that?
Yeah, again.
Same with homosexuals?
Potentially the same, right. In this country, we have the history of the Tuskegee experiment, which is documented in a book called Bad Blood by James Jones. There we see the 40-year experiment conducted in the open medical literature. Again, not a single doctor came forward to say or stop this experiment where black men were recruited in Tuskegee, Alabama by the Center for Disease Control, the Public Health Service. They were followed and watched the progression of the syphilis in these black men. And when penicillin became available, they were specifically prevented from being treated so that they could watch the progression of the syphilis in them. And simultaneously, we saw the infection of their wives and congenitally born syphilitic children. And none of this was stopped after penicillin became available. This was all conducted in the open medical literature. When the survivors of this experiment finally learned of what was actually going on, they sued in a class action suit against the Public Health Service and won millions of dollars. And that is all documented in a book called Bad Blood.
Okay, we're going to take another short break. We'll be right back with more of On the Record. question, of course. Now we've got the military requesting it. We've got scientists saying, yeah, we can do that. We've got scientists working towards it, and then somehow it gets into the human population. You still believe it's possible it might have been an accident, not necessarily something.
Right. It's possible because the way vaccines are prepared. And that is, a lot of times vaccines use animal sera as plasma expanders. Or, for instance, in Africa, when they did the smallpox campaign of eradication, they actually took the smallpox directly from cattle. The vaccine was prepared in cows and then put directly into humans. So the viruses that contaminate cattle, of course, could be inoculated directly into humans. And so that is one explanation of how it could have been inoculated as an accident. The same as millions of Americans were inoculated with the virus named SV40, a contaminating virus of the original polio preparations in this country. 45 million Americans approximately were given this virus, and that again is a problem of contamination of the culture media. That virus has the potential to cause cancer, particularly brain cancers and kidney cancer in humans. So there is a history, a precedent of this sort of contaminated problem.
There's also a history of scientists targeting out a particular population, an ethnic group, a racial group. You say that the Japanese had experience like this going on decades ago.
Yes, particularly, and that all began before World War II, before our involvement with World War II. And documented in a book called Unit 731 by Wallace and Williams, British writers. There they talk about the horrific experiments of Dr. Ishii and his Unit 731 and the specific attempts to produce viruses and bacteria that had ethnic specificity. In other words, as far back as the late 30s, early 40s, doctors were already interested in producing viruses and bacteria that could selectively destroy specific racial or ethnic groups.
Okay. A little bit into the transmission, how it spread. We're going to have to save most of this for next week, but for quite some time, the prevailing view was that one flight steward was responsible for it. Before we get into him, you're familiar with the most recent report that indicates some sailor, an English sailor, I believe, who died, had some of his cells preserved, and they think he had the AIDS virus back in the 50s.
Right.
How can that be if it was made in a lab in the 70s?
Well, again, the key is the virus, no matter where it came from originally, how does it get into humans? And the key is that it's adapted to humans by growth in tissue culture, in our opinion. The question of the guy in 1959 is very interesting because, first off, here we have tissue that's supposedly been dead and preserved for almost 30 years, and they're now telling us that they're getting an AIDS virus out of it. That tells us a great deal about how actually stable this virus actually is. You see, they want people to believe that the virus just lands on a dry surface and poof, it's dead. But now they're telling us that this guy's tissue's been laying around, it's been dead for 30 years, and they're able to get a virus out of it that supposedly dies almost within minutes of exposure. That's suspicious. Secondly, again, the real question is, for the last several years, then billions of dollars, the doctors, the researchers, the biologists have been telling us that essentially God doesn't exist and evolution is the name of the game. There hasn't been one word spoken about the true evolution of this virus. It's as if, poof, it just appears in this guy in 1959. The real question is, where did he get it? Who did he contact it from? Who did he spread it to? How come none of them died of AIDS? And how come the outbreak of AIDS in Africa, where he allegedly contacted it, didn't appear in the 60s? Of course, all of that says that most of this information is a little suspicious. Quite frankly, still in our opinion, it really doesn't matter, because we're still left looking at the request for AIDS in 72. Again, what we say is actually it's immaterial what the true progenitor of AIDS is, because AIDS represents the true fruition of the request of production in 1972.
And you think it's going to be a lot worse than maybe medicine is letting on?
Well, we think, already what we see is that in an annihilation of Africa within the next 5 or 10 years, and the United States is not so far behind that. We see South and Central America with tremendous problems. Brazil is already facing total economic disruption due to the AIDS virus there. And it will spread out contiguously from Brazil into the surrounding South and Central American countries and have the same devastation there that it's going to have or having at the present time in Africa.
I mean, how bad in Africa? I saw heard one statistic about half of the people in the nation of Uganda.
Yes, the latest statistics from Africa, particularly through what they call the AIDS belt or the central sub-Saharan areas of Africa, show 75% of large populations already infected. And those people will die in the next 5 or 10 years short of there being a cure. And of course, that's the number presently infected. In a few years, there could be virtually 100%.
Dr. Strecker, you have a lot to say about how this disease is spread exactly and what we can do or can't do to protect ourselves. Have to have you back next week for that. So join us again next week for part 2 of this interview with Dr. Strecker. See you then. Who delivered some rather disturbing news. Dr. Strecker has spent the last several years researching the AIDS virus and is convinced that the virus was created in a lab, was probably distributed on purpose, and is likely to kill a lot more of us than anyone is letting on. Strecker says his evidence comes from some of the same medical professionals who now disavow any knowledge of an AIDS project. Dr. Strecker is back for part 2 of our discussion. Good to have you here again.
Thank you.
We're also joined in this half hour by Tony Pelham, well known, I think, to Las Vegas television viewers and newspaper readers. Used to be a reporter with Las Vegas Bullet and has been doing a lot of research in this area for quite some time. Dr. Strecker, to begin with, those who didn't see the program last week, your qualifications, what you know, and how you know it.
Right. As I always say, there's really only one qualification necessary to determine the truth, the validity of our story, and that's the capability of being able to read. But for my own education, just for those who are interested, I went to Vanderbilt Medical School. I did an MD, PhD there. I have a PhD in pharmacology. After medical school, I did 4 years of medicine, followed by 2 years of gastroenterology and 3 years of pathology. I'm board certified in medicine and gastroenterology. And I practice medicine. I think of myself as a conservative doctor, except in this field, I'm probably, well, I know that I'm branded as sort of a radical doctor, but again, the kind of medicine that I practice, I think of as very conservative.
You started doing this research for use in a health plan.
Yes.
And you found some pretty disturbing results right off the bat. What's the thesis?
The thesis is basically that AIDS came from a laboratory, not from the jungles of Africa. AIDS is a result of work in the cancer research and biowarfare research that's gone on since the 60s. In a sense, the virus was requested in the late 60s, early 70s. It was produced by crossing 2 viruses from animals, one from cattle, one from sheep, and then it was adapted, the original AIDS virus was adapted to humans by growth in human tissue. It was then spread either accidentally or intentionally worldwide through vaccine campaigns.
Okay, last week you established that the Department of Defense wanted something like this built.
Yes.
That a number of scientists said, yeah, we can do that.
Yes.
That according to the papers, they actually did it, and somewhere along the line, it got into the human population.
Right.
Now the question is anybody going to survive it? And perhaps the way to answer that question is, how does it spread? One of the main ways we've been told it spread, or one of the main sources, is this flight attendant who hopped around having homosexual affairs all over the country. And I guess the CDC actually followed this guy around for a while.
Yeah, well, this is a very fascinating story. I find it fascinating because let's just assume that it were true. We just think it's fiction, but let's assume that it's true. I think then you have to ask, why did the CDC, whose job it is to stop the spread of the disease, why didn't they interdict and stop this person from spreading a disease that's virtually 100% fatal? Why were they merely following him around and watching the spread of virus disease that virtually kills everyone that it grows in? We think that it's not true because, again, if you look at the epidemiology of AIDS, particularly in the United States, it doesn't correspond in any way to the location in the cities where this person lived, worked, and recreated. He basically flew for a Canadian airline that was based in Canada, flying to Canada, Europe, and the United States. Why didn't AIDS break out in Canada if he was the source? Canada's virtually AIDS-free. AIDS broke out in the United States in select cities, in select times. 1978 in New York, in Manhattan, then in San Francisco, Los Angeles in 1980, essentially. Those are not the flight patterns of this steward. So epidemiologically speaking, we say it's just not, doesn't hold water. Again, if it were true, the real question in my mind would be, why didn't the CDC interdict and stop this person from spreading the disease?
You believe somehow that it was released into those specific populations, San Francisco, New York?
Right. Again, if you look at the epidemiology of AIDS in the United States, the epidemiology corresponds to vaccine programs that were conducted. In other words, what is the epidemiology of AIDS? It's select cities, select times, and here it's a select population group. Young white male homosexuals between the ages of 20 and 40 who are otherwise healthy and promiscuous. That corresponds exactly to the hepatitis B vaccine study conducted in the same cities, in the same time, in the same group. And so we're right back to a vaccine project. And again, we think that AIDS was probably introduced either accidentally or intentionally in this country by the vaccine projects.
How can, in this country, we blame it on the homosexual community when clearly in places like Uganda, it's been proven that the heterosexual behavior is the main form of transmission?
Exactly. Well, that's the key to this whole discussion. How do you change a black heterosexual disease affecting millions of Africans into a young white male homosexual disease of Manhattan? That is the main question that's been completely avoided by all the, quote, AIDS experts and doctors who never discuss how we change a heterosexual disease of Africa into a white male homosexual disease in Manhattan. Our explanation is quite simple. That's where the virus was, in a sense, inoculated. We don't believe that the virus runs uniquely in homosexuals. We believe that the virus is running in homosexuals because that's where it was put.
And it's accepted now at this time that virtually 3/4 at least of the globe's countries have some form of AIDS. Is it logical that within 1 decade this disease could have spread?
Well, not only again, AIDS is now in 146 countries, and in 145 of them, AIDS is a heterosexual disease. It's only in the United States that AIDS is a homosexual disease, essentially. So again, you have to ask yourself, how is it that AIDS is uniquely homosexual here, which is now becoming less and less so all the time, and heterosexual in the rest of the world? The answer is, AIDS is a virus that will kill human beings, not just homosexuals. And again, the reason that it's in homosexuals here is because we think that's where it was put.
On purpose to wipe out the homosexual population, or it's just speculation?
Yeah, that's speculation. Again, I mean, that gets back to as we discussed last week, the most interesting discussion in this whole topic is who put it where. That's where we have the least science and the most speculation and the most interesting. We all have our own opinions. You give me a scenario, I'll give you an answer.
Okay, tell me about sex, though, as a role, as the agent for transmitting this disease, about the idea that you can prevent it with condoms.
Right.
You're not buying.
No, we don't buy any of that. And the reason is because AIDS is not a sexually transmitted disease.
Can it be sexually transmitted?
It's transmitted during sex, absolutely. But it's not a sexually transmitted disease. You look at all the viral diseases, mumps, measles, chickenpox. Look at bacterial diseases, tuberculosis, even some vector-borne diseases, malaria. If we define as a sexually transmitted disease any disease transferred during sex, virtually that makes every disease a sexually transmitted disease, including malaria if you happen to get bombed by a mosquito during the act. That's not a true definition. The definition of a sexually transmitted disease has something to do with sex. Like what the true sexually transmitted diseases are, like syphilis, gonorrhea, herpes. These agents grow in the venereal tract. They're present in high concentrations. They don't live outside the body for long periods of time. They really do like moist mucous membranes, like occur in the venereals, in other words, in the penis or in the vagina, and they're primarily transferred during sex. AIDS does not grow in the venereal tract. It lives outside the body for at least 10 days, as proven by the French and published in 87 in Lancet. It's virtually non-existent in the venereal tract. In other words, its concentration is very, very low, and there's no evidence it's primarily transferred by sex. That doesn't mean it isn't transferred during sex. It is. But there may be a host of other ways that it's transferred, such as by saliva or by mother's milk or by other blood-to-blood contact.
All of which have been dismissed by most of the medical authorities on
Right.
this.
But all of those, of course, are now proven beyond any doubt. It's well documented that babies have been infected by mothers by breastfeeding that were infected.
And doctors and dentists through contact with saliva.
Right, and doctors and dentists, and now even a patient who may have been infected by a dentist who was infected. He may have transferred it to her. That's been recently published here.
I guess the idea that dentists wear all these masks and gloves and things indicates that maybe they know something about it we don't? Or
Well, they were directed
as a
to
precaution?
as a precaution of getting an infection of the dentist from the patient. And of course, perhaps the other way is maybe the patient should be as concerned about being infected from the dentist or the doctor.
Okay, we're going to take a short break. We'll be right back.
Who says business is bad?
Strecker about AIDS, where it came from, where it's going. Tony Pelham resumes questioning.
Doctor, I read the recent reports on the research that was done in Belgrade, Florida, the doctors that are coping with the AIDS in Belgrade, the impoverished area of the fruit pickers, and they seem to think emphatically that the mosquito is transferring the AIDS virus between the children especially.
Right. Again, well, the interesting thing about Belgrade, as you brought out just now, was the fact that there are a large number of children afflicted with AIDS. And Drs. Whiteside and McLeod from the Tropical Disease Institute in Miami went to Belgrade and looked at the situation and concluded that AIDS was being moved by blood-sucking insects, particularly mosquitoes or other tabanid-like horseflies, tabanid horseflies. The CDC went to Belgrade and made the exact opposite conclusion, but they still, in a sense, have really no explanation as to how do you account for the children or the elderly that are being infected who really aren't sexually active. We believe that the virus will be moved by blood-sucking insects, particularly mosquitoes or tabanid horseflies or other blood-sucking insects, if they're able or capable of moving macrophages, one of the large white blood cells that runs in the human blood system. The macrophage is the main mechanism of transfer, we think, not only for perhaps insects, but probably for humans. And of course, one of the interesting parts is we think this is the first cellularly transferred disease of humans. In other words, this is a disease of humans moved by a cell, a mobile, large, giant white blood cell of the system, may be the mechanism of how it gets in and out of different people.
So then if you're correct about the mosquitoes, then do you account for that being part of the reason that the numbers are so astronomical in Africa, that being a tropical area?
Exactly. And in fact, even in the New England Journal of Medicine, in recent publications, they show that AIDS is much higher in areas where there's a high incidence of malaria. And we believe that's due to the co-transfer of the two diseases. In other words, AIDS and malaria being moved together, particularly by vectors, mosquitoes. And that's how you account for the fact that the very old and the very young in Africa are getting infected. Not that they're sexually active, because they're not. They're getting infected from vectors.
What is your explanation for when people, journalists especially, travel to Africa, that if in fact your numbers are correct, that it runs into the tens of millions at this time, why don't we see it in the news media in this country? I mean, why isn't the general public aware that it's in the tens of millions?
Because there's no interest. Just like there's really no interest in Iraq before they invaded Kuwait, there's really no interest in what happens in Africa. And Africa will, in our opinion, die off within the next few years. The numbers coming out of African hospitals, just in the latest, I just was in the library a couple of nights ago looking up some information on AIDS and stumbled into some recent, just published material from Africa, which shows that, for instance, in Uganda already, 50% of all hospital admissions in Uganda are directly related to AIDS. So the disease incidence is clearly exploding there.
You're saying Africa is gone.
We think Africa is gone. We think that this disease will exterminate Africa in the next 5 to 10 years. And you're going to be able, again, as we said in 1984, AIDS is a virtually 100% lethal disease.
And people
said we're paranoid lunatics. Today everybody knows that AIDS is virtually 100% lethal. You're going to be able to say in about 4 or 5 years whether we were right about or wrong about Africa, because in 5 years I'll guarantee you that you're going to be able to go to Africa and see dramatic population implosion due to the AIDS pandemic.
Basically, we're talking about exchange of fluid still, right? For spread.
Exactly, for spread.
Right. Saliva, blood, semen,
right. Anything that can contain the virus or the cell, the macrophage cell. Anything that would allow for blood-to-blood contact. In a sense, AIDS is a disease transferred like hepatitis B. So if you believe, and we don't believe, again, we don't believe hepatitis B is a true sexually transmitted disease for the same reasons we've said before. But it's well known that hepatitis B is transferred during intercourse occasionally.
Why has it been slow, though, at least in this country? There's so many different ways to spread it. Why is it still, it's the concentration, the homosexual population, the intravenous drug users account for most of the cases? Why hasn't it spread? I mean, it is spreading now more slowly into heterosexual.
I'll tell you why we say that that's true. And this has to do with the hepatitis B vaccine study. In 1975, before the study was conducted, they looked at hepatitis B in homosexuals and heterosexuals. And what they discovered was there were two types of hepatitis B. In other words, there was the kind running in homosexuals and there was the kind running in heterosexuals, and they weren't identical. Now that's very interesting, because what that tells you is that there's some kind of barrier that exists between these two populations, because if there was a large exchange of information going on, the viruses wouldn't be capable of separating out into two distinct types because it's the same virus. What that tells us is if you introduce a disease that's spread like hepatitis B into the homosexual group, it will be a long time before it appears in the heterosexual group.
So then the millions of dollars that have been spent educating our public that if they'll use a condom, then they can prevent AIDS, the kissing then is just as likely to spread the AIDS? Or is
we think that's correct. And the reason that we don't think condoms will work are several. First off, condoms break. Natural condoms have holes in them that are as large or larger than the virus. Plus, macrophages move in and out of those holes every day. Natural condoms are made from the intestines of animals. And of course, macrophages are moving in and out of those holes in those condoms every second of every day. If the macrophage is the true mechanism of spread, it's very important to know that in that case. Latex condoms deteriorate, they break, and if you look at pregnancy, it has a failure rate of about 14–15%. And you can only become pregnant 3 or 4 days out of the month, relatively speaking. In AIDS, you can become AIDS infected 30 days out of the month. So you would expect a 10-fold increase in failure, which would put us at a virtually 100% failure rate predicted for condoms if we're expecting it to prevent AIDS.
According to the medical community, you can be infected with the virus and it doesn't show up in a test for a number of weeks. So then when we go to our local blood bank and we see people given blood, is it still possible that the AIDS-carrying virus carriers are giving blood now still, and that will go into our blood bank, or has that been corrected?
It's still possible, and there's never, so far, there's no test that's virtually 100% for detecting all AIDS-positive blood. The numbers are much better. We've reduced the incidence. In other words, the numbers that would slip through are very small now, like 1 in 50,000 or 1 in 100,000. So it's greatly reduced that risk of AIDS-infected blood. But again, here what people must realize is that there's a whole lot more going on besides AIDS. At the same time they test the blood for AIDS, they're also testing it for HTLV1, human T-cell leukemia virus, which is, in our opinion, the father of AIDS. And they should be testing for HTLV2, which is hairy cell leukemia virus. And so you see, if there were only AIDS, you probably couldn't make any of these conclusions, but it's the company that it keeps that leads you to these conclusions.
You got to realize this kind of stuff is going to scare the heck out of people. I can hear the doctors out there in the audience saying, this is doing no one any good to scare them like this, that there's everyone's going to get it, that there's no protection, that everything we know about this is wrong. If you're wrong, we're doing a great disservice to the public right now.
Again, people can decide for themselves whether we're right or wrong by looking at the information that we can supply them. You judge the true character of any hypothesis by its predictive ability. If you look at the history of AIDS, you must ask yourself, who had the better predictive ability? Was it the CDC in 1984, 1985 when it said only 10% of those with AIDS would have a problem and transfer it? Or was it us when we said virtually 100%, and they called it paranoid lunacy, would have 100% would have a problem and die? Again, we believe that our hypotheses and theories have already proven out to be correct. And the only question is, in the near future, will our additional hypotheses be proven to be correct?
Does it bother you that a lot of this information that you have developed, and pretty much you alone in the country, has fallen into the hands of some fairly out there right-wing political types who are using it for their own ends. Let's quarantine the homosexuals. Let's quarantine everyone who's got it. I mean, some pretty far-out philosophies about it.
Right. Again, we give our information to anybody who wants to look. That would include right-wing groups that have used it, left-wing groups that have used it. I can tell you this officially, that it's been said, well, we're spreading Soviet disinformation. That comes from whatever wing you want to look at. On the other hand, the left wing says we're right-wing fascists. The right wing says we're left-wing, and the middle says they don't want to look at all. So the basis of all this is I went into the medical literature, spent the last 6 years reading it. I drew these conclusions myself, and until I really find a reason to change my own thinking, I still have to maintain I believe this because of these things. Whether people want to look at that or confront it is their own decision. We use the illustration of a sense like if somebody poisoned your water supply, would you want to be told? And if you say no, well, then you don't want to look at what we have to say. If you say yes, then I think you might want to read what we can point you to.
Okay, we're going to take another short break. When we come back, discuss the possibility of a cure or a vaccine. Stay with us. When you need Strecker, who has brought us some pretty disturbing news about AIDS. Tony Pelham resumes the questioning.
Doctor, one of the things that seems to disturb most of the people that review your tape is your comparison to the common cold. For 40 years, our doctors tried to find a cure for the common cold, and they were unsuccessful. And in a way, they feel that there's no possibility of a cure for AIDS. How do you feel about that?
Well, we believe there is a cure for AIDS, but even if there weren't, we still don't think that really diminishes the validity of any of our findings. And even if I couldn't say that there's no cure possible, which we think there is, and I'll discuss that, but we still think people have the right or actually should know the truth. I personally would want to know if that were the case. Now, we don't believe there will be a drug cure for AIDS. We think that the cure for AIDS will come from a physical technique, the physics of disease rather than sort of the drug therapy. We think that the 1990s and the 21st century will really, if we have any 21st century, will really be a history of the development of physical medicine, actual physics applied to medicine. And particularly what I'm talking about is the electromagnetics applied to medicine. The theory of how we think AIDS can be cured in principle is very simple. It's like a crystal glass. If you treat that glass with the right audio tone, you can shatter a crystal glass. Now, viruses and bacteria and humans are basically crystalline in structure. And the theory is that if you would treat the virus or bacteria with the proper pulsed electromagnetic wave and in a sense make the crystalline structure of the virus vibrate, increase its amplitude, you could basically blow it apart. And that's how we think that this disease will be cured.
Blood warming? What do you think about that?
Blood warming. We think that's an initial crude attempt at what we've just discussed. In other words, blood warming may well cure some people with AIDS. I actually think that these people in Atlanta who were treated probably are better. One of them certainly looks better. I know that Dr. Alonso had gone to Mexico and treated several more people the last few weeks. And it'll be interesting to see if they get better. The theory there being is how is he warming the blood? And I don't know exactly how he warms the blood, but if in sense he's using some kind of microwaves, it could be that he's doing in a crude attempt what we think is the final solution to this problem.
Is this a shift in your position for you? Because it seemed like the first time I met you and we talked, I got the impression that we're all going to die. At least that's what you believe.
Well, I think that that's true in a sense if we don't develop these techniques. This goes back to a guy named Raymond Royal Rife who worked in the early 1920s and 30s. Rife was an inventor, a microscopist, tinkerer, who said that he developed a way to cure viruses and bacteria electronically. And again, I believe that that's where the cure for this disease lies. I don't think we'll find a drug cure. And so if we depend and we simply wait for the development of a drug, I think we could all die from this. And I'm not the only one that feels that. Dr. Hazeltine from Harvard, in testimony before Congress here, said AIDS is a species-threatening virus, and that's the AIDS virus by itself. So Hazeltine was saying, this virus has the capability of exterminating mankind.
So AZT and any of these other types of drugs, they're just masking the problem. They're just maybe trying to prolong the carrier's life by a couple of years.
Right. In other words, AZT is in a sense like most cases of chemotherapy. It really only promotes life for weeks or months. It's not a cure by any means, and I don't think that's where we need to be looking at. Again, I believe that that it will be a physical process, somehow discussing, actually talking to the genetic makeup is what it will require to cure this disease, because this virus actually integrates into your genes.
I want to tell, only got about 30 seconds left. Folks, if you want more information, get a pencil ready. We've got a number coming up for you. Very quickly, Dr. Strecker, what would you say to doctors out there in about 15 seconds who might not be buying what you've got to say?
To look at our information and read it for themselves. Again, we're not telling them what to believe. We would just like people, including doctors, to look at our own information and see.
What's the 800 number you've got?
800-548-3198. 548-3198.
And folks, if you didn't get that, we've got the